Hello and welcome to the inaugural video review for the In the Ocean. I'm going to start with a review of a game that I think doesn't get anywhere near as much attention as it deserves. So without further ado, let's press on with looking at Mega Monster Mania. Now, Xbox Live Indie Games isn't starved for roguelikes. What it is starved for is games about hyperactive, ice-skating squareheads swinging swords the size of obelisks in frantic drive-by slashings of kamikaze baby seals. Initially, Mega Monster Mania gives the impression of being a dungeon crawl. There are a few of those on Xbox Live Indie Games already, possibly the most reputable of which is Epic Dungeon by iHook Games, now updated as Cursed Loot. If you loosen the definition a bit to include games that aren't strictly roguelikes or dungeon crawls but share many of their qualities, such as Lair of the Evildoer, the number is quite healthy. Mega Monster Mania fits best into this latter category. It has some elements of a dungeon crawl, some other elements of a traditional roguelike, and some qualities of a sugar-fueled child convulsively beating its fists against every object in sight because it just has too much energy not to. And that's what really sets Mega Monster Mania apart from its fellows. In the simplest terms, energy. Roguelikes traditionally centre around trawling for loot through a series of randomly generated floors, and the layout of the floors is revealed only through exploration. Mega Monster Mania does tick all of these roguelike boxes, but it doesn't stop there. It continues ticking right to the edge of the page and onto the table, giggling all the while. The most traditional games in the genre on Xbox Live Indie Games, that's maybe Dungeon Adventure, or more recently Denizen's Den, are quite slow, deliberate affairs despite the rapid pace of their combat. They emphasise slogging along lengthy corridors, mapping out each floor painstakingly until you find the exit or just tire of looking for stuff to pick up. Even Epic Dungeon, which picks up the pace a bit, still has the feel of a steady trudge. Now, this isn't a criticism, it's just the nature of the game, and I'm a fan of this type of game. They just come at a slower pace. Mega Monster Mania, on the other hand, is the cocky blue hedgehog of dungeon crawls. Mega and Mania are really the applicable bits of the title here. It looks into the tarry stew of the roguelike and spices it up with the Tabasco gauntlet. Everything happens very quickly. Enemies charge at you full tilt whenever you come into view, and many of them move faster than you do. Some shoot fireballs in various patterns, but the sense of speed comes mainly from two features. Firstly, literal speed of movement. Your character, as well as the enemies, skates around everywhere like the 80s never left us, and you'll often find yourself accidentally skidding headlong into a throng of monsters before you even see that they're there. It's particularly noticeable in the ice stages, which follow the traditional game ice level route of dramatically reducing friction. Your character skids and bounces around like a pinball in these icy levels. And as I say, it's not just you. Many of the enemies move similarly, giving them an erratic edge that really cranks up the panic when you accidentally blunder into a room that's teeming with them. Secondly, the game controls a little like a twin-stick shooter. This makes sense when you're using a bow. You nudge the right stick in any direction to shoot an arrow that way, or hold it down for sustained, repeated fire. If you play anything like me, though, more commonly you'll be swinging a sword the size of a small car, and this is also done using the right stick. And these two features, the speed of movement and the very quick, accessible, slightly twitchy control scheme, combine to give Mega Monster Mania a really frantic pace that's at odds with most games of this type. Personally, I coped with the speed by developing a joust-like style of combat. I'd pop off a few arrows from a distance to soften up my enemies as they approached, then charge in headlong, narrowly avoiding my target and carving it up with my sword as I passed, before pulling a skidding 180 to take another run at them. It works quite well, but it's unlike the combat in any other game of the dungeon crawling type that you might have played. Action is certainly the emphasis here. When Mega Monster Mania's developers threw the traditional trundling pace of the roguelike on the junk heap, they followed it with character levelling. They lobbed that out of the window as well. Of course, your character needs to grow in power to cope with the increasing challenge, but this is done entirely through equipment. The game's item drops fall into three broad types. Usable items, essentially a handful of trinkets that offer short-term bonuses or quick damage, money, and equipment. Now, even your gear isn't permitted to slow down the frantic pace of the game. New weapons and armour can only be equipped in the shop at the end of each floor. So there's no need, or indeed option, to manage your inventory, or even simply glance to see what you just picked up. All you can do is charge onwards towards the exit. Once you leave each floor, you can weigh up the damage, protection, and bonus stats and effects and so on of the gear you picked up on that floor. Sell anything you don't want, and move on. Now, I can't have a look at Mega Monster Mania without commenting on the visual style. This was the first thing that struck me when I first started playing the game, thanks to its oddness, frankly. Initially, I couldn't decide whether it was intentionally distinctive or just lazy, and I'm still not entirely sure. Your character is a square, with some hair and a pair of eyes to indicate that you're meant to be looking down on the top of someone's head. No visible limbs or animation other than your weapon swinging without any arms. Just your little square guy, and little square enemies, or occasionally larger enemies of similarly geometric shapes. It was a little baffling at first, but once I got used to the style, I actually quite liked it. Now, this visual style, combined with the rocket-propelled pace of the gameplay, give it a quite distinctive feel that cements the game in my memory much more firmly than its admittedly fairly forgettable title does. Besides, colourful yet minimalist kind of fits the general tone of Mega Monster Mania. Sadly, this game hasn't managed to shed the main failing of the roguelike dungeon crawl. That is, repetition. Even the best game in this genre falls prey to the eventual feeling of battling through yet another floor full of enemies, opening chests, swigging potions, and just trudging onward. And Mega Monster Mania is no different in that regard. Its quick pace helps to stave off this sense of repetition. But the trade-off for the pace is the lack of depth that would be provided by customization through leveling your character or being able to tweak your equipment on the fly, which is the method that others like Epic Dungeon use to hold our attention. Unlike most of its counterparts in the dungeon crawling genre, Mega Monster Mania hasn't really bothered to implement a save system. Now, that's not to say there's no save at all. That actually could work. We see it in the PC roguelike / twin-stick shooter, The Binding of Isaac. Each adventure is a fresh one, and you push as far as possible into the dungeon from the beginning each time. That can work. The problem in Mega Monster Mania is that it sits uncomfortably between the two extremes. It doesn't have a fully implemented save system, and it doesn't have a complete blank slate, no save way of doing things. It remembers which floor you reached, and lets you keep your equipment and weapons, but your disposable items, potions and so on, and your gold are reset to the basics. No gold, 10 potions, and no other disposable items. The lack of gold is particularly troublesome, because once you're a few floors into the dungeon, you'll need every potion you can get, and 10 just isn't enough. The game doesn't play very fair in cutting you down to that bare minimum of 10, and not giving you any option to buy more. simply because you had to go and have dinner and come back later. Even your character's appearance has to be selected anew each time. Now, that's not a huge inconvenience, because it's just a matter of selecting one from a handful of options. And the effects are entirely cosmetic. But it's still an unnecessary inconvenience. There's really no reason to think you do that every time. Games mastered the idea of saving 25 years ago. The other major problem with Mega Monster Mania is the clumsy item selection system. And this one impacts directly on the gameplay. For the most part, the game's controls are minimalist, and that makes them effective for the rapid battles. You flick between weapons, which you'll probably only have 2, maybe 3 of, with the right bumper, and you attack, as I mentioned, with the right stick. Easy, simple. Unfortunately, the disposable items, which can be very, very useful, are selected by the same method as the weapons. That is, you cycle through them with the left bumper. Considering how quick the combat is, how rapidly enemies can descend upon you, having to tap the button 4 or 5 times to reach a potion or a bomb to save your life can result in you getting killed more often than you really should. Not to mention the hassle of memorising the sequence of items, so you don't have to risk your life glancing away from the action to check whether you're about to drink a life-saving potion or give yourself a speed boost right into an enemy's face. It wouldn't be so bad if we could work around this by selling off the disposable items we never use. In my case, I never ever use the speed boost, and I'd be happy to offload that for a bit of gold. But, unlike equipment and weapons, you can't sell these consumable items. Having said that, these 2 main flaws, the weird, half-baked save system and the awkward item selection system, aren't enough to scupper the entire game. They are niggly annoyances, but they are only niggly annoyances. Even the awkward middle ground half-save is only a noticeable problem if you frequently leave the game and come back. And you probably won't do that very often. It's not that sort of game. It's one you'll play in occasional bursts of an hour or 2. Now, sometimes something might come up that will require you to leave and come back, and in that case, the save is annoying. But mostly, you'll probably just have a solid run through it for an hour or 2. As to the other problems, the use of consumable items becomes key to your success as you progress further. And like me, you'll soon learn which ones you use most and which ones you never use at all. And you'll be able to remember to tap the left bumper 3 times to select a particular item. A lot of the time, you'll also be able to tell when you're about to enter an area that's crawling with enemies, and you can have a plan in mind to have a certain item ready to use as you go in, and then quickly switch to a potion or another item that you want to use once you're in there. I'm not trying to make excuses for the clumsiness of this item selection system, but it doesn't ruin the game. And when I sat down and thought about it, I had trouble coming up with a better way to implement it that wouldn't involve taking your thumb off one of the sticks in the middle of combat. The D-pad, for instance, would be a good way to switch between items, but you'd have to let go of the left stick, and the combat is so fast and hectic that you can't really afford to do that. So, taken as a whole, I'd have to recommend Mega Monster Mania. It's easy to learn and easy to play, but not easy. It's challenging, like most dungeon crawls. It provides the procedurally generated exploration hijinks of a roguelike, but it streamlines everything, and it cranks up the speed to an alarming pace. Its curious visual style becomes quite charming once you adjust to it. And if you have a friend who fancies tackling a high-speed loot trawl with you, there's a two-player mode, though as far as I've been able to work out, it's only local, which is a shame. So if you have the slightest interest in charging through a dungeon full of enemies in search of treasure, you should certainly at least check out Mega Monster Mania. If you've ever tried a game like Epic Dungeon, Cursed Loot, Dungeon Adventure, anything of that nature, and found them enjoyable but a bit sedate, you might find the faster pace of Mega Monster Mania right up your street. With even the full game costing a mere 80 Microsoft points, the equivalent of about 60p in my homeland, or $1 US, you really don't have much to lose by giving it a go. So I'll leave the inaugural episode of the Indie Ocean video reviews with a glowing but slightly qualified recommendation for Mega Monster Mania. Thanks for listening.